The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly as the air carried a sense of cold authority, the kind that silences questions and amplifies power. She had been sitting quietly in the waiting area, hands resting on her lap, her composure unbroken despite the stares from officers and civilians alike. She had done nothing wrong, she knew that, but the eyes of the officers scanning her from head to toe carried an assumption that spoke volumes. "You don't look like you belong here," the officer said, his voice laced with disdain as he approached her. "I'm waiting for someone," she replied calmly, her tone betraying no hint of the frustration simmering beneath her controlled demeanor. The officer smirked, leaning closer, towering over her with an air of intimidation. "Funny, because you fit the description of someone causing trouble nearby. We don't tolerate that here." Before she could protest, he motioned for her to stand. She hesitated, her mind racing, knowing exactly where this was going. "I'm not here for trouble," she said firmly. But he wasn't listening. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his hand already reaching for his belt. "I have every right to be here," she asserted, her voice strong but calm, trying to keep the situation from escalating. "Oh, you have rights now, huh?" he sneered. Then, without warning, he pulled out a canister of pepper spray. The room seemed to freeze. She raised her hands slowly, her eyes meeting his. "Don't do this," she warned, her voice steady, the calm before a storm. But he didn't stop. A hiss of aerosol cut through the air, followed by a sharp, blinding pain. The world around her blurred, her vision burning as she stumbled back, gasping. Laughter and murmurs echoed around her as she wiped at her eyes in vain, trying to push through the agony. "Welcome to reality," the officer muttered, walking away as if nothing had happened. Reality, she thought bitterly as she steadied herself, was far more complicated than this man could imagine. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she wasn't just some random woman they could bully and intimidate. She had walked into that police station for a reason, and it wasn't the one they thought. Her mind raced as she pushed past the humiliation and pain, her training taking over. She had to stay calm, even as the anger surged inside her like a tidal wave. Not now, she told herself. Not yet. In the hours that followed, she observed, listening to the chatter, the offhand comments, the boasts of authority unchecked. Each word, each detail, was being recorded in her mind, a mental file growing thicker by the second. "You shouldn't have done that," someone murmured to the officer who had sprayed her. He shrugged, dismissing the concern. "Who's gonna stop me? She's just another one of them." But he was wrong. She wasn't just another one. Every step she took that day had been calculated, every decision deliberate. What started as an unprovoked act of humiliation would unravel into something far greater, something he would never see coming. What would happen when the truth about her identity came to light? How would the officer react when he realized the woman he had degraded wasn't just another citizen but someone with the power to dismantle everything he thought he controlled? The answer to those questions would shock everyone, especially him. But for now, she let the fire burn silently within her, knowing that when the moment came, it wouldn't just be justice, it would be karma served cold. And as she wiped her eyes one last time, her vision clearing, one thought echoed in her mind: he doesn't know who I am. But he's about to find out. What happens next will leave you speechless. Will justice prevail, or will the cycle of abuse and power continue? Stay with us as the story unfolds, revealing a shocking truth that no one in that station saw coming. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To every black viewer watching this, we want you to know that your experiences matter, your voice matters, and you deserve respect and dignity. This channel is a safe space where we expose injustice and share stories that inspire change and reflection. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. You're in for a powerful and emotional story today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our mission of storytelling with impact. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. The morning had started like any other in Atlanta. The air was heavy with humidity, the streets buzzing with the usual mix of cars, pedestrians, and the distant wail of sirens. The police precinct sat near the edge of downtown, a squat, gray building with a faded flag fluttering half-heartedly in the breeze. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but routine, officers moving between desks, phones ringing, and the low hum of conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter or frustration. Among the officers, Detective Paul Radford was a familiar face. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating the system and bending it to his will. Paul was a man of contrasts, a devoted father to his two sons but a polarizing figure at work. He was known for his results but also for his temper and a troubling pattern of complaints that seemed to follow him. Among his peers, he was both admired and feared; among the public, he was a name whispered with equal parts disdain and frustration. Paul's reputation wasn't unwarranted. He believed in his authority, and he had no patience for anyone who questioned it. For him, the badge wasn't just a symbol of service, it was a shield, a weapon, and a crown. He had climbed the ranks through sheer determination, but his methods often left a trail of broken trust and bruised spirits. For years, he had managed to brush off accusations of misconduct, often aided by a system that seemed more interested in protecting its own than holding them accountable. Across town, Alexis Monroe was finishing her morning coffee in a quiet cafe. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow in the sunlight and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she wore a crisp blazer over jeans, a look that blended professionalism with ease. Alexis was meticulous in everything she did, from the way she stirred her coffee to the way she planned her day. Born and raised in Chicago, Alexis had spent her childhood watching her parents fight tirelessly for their community. Her father had been a teacher, her mother a social worker, and together they had instilled in her a deep sense of justice and a refusal to back down in the face of adversity. Those values had shaped her career choices, leading her first to law school and then to the FBI, where she had quickly risen through the ranks. Alexis had a quiet strength about her, the kind that made people sit up and take notice. She didn't have to raise her voice to command a room, her presence was enough. Her colleagues respected her for her sharp mind and unwavering determination, though some found her intensity intimidating. She wasn't the type to back away from a challenge, especially when it involved uncovering the truth and holding people accountable. That morning, Alexis had a reason to be in Atlanta. For weeks, she had been leading an undercover investigation into reports of corruption and misconduct within the city's police department. The precinct she was visiting had been flagged repeatedly for its troubling patterns, excessive force, racial profiling, and an alarming number of complaints that never seemed to lead to any real consequences. Alexis had chosen to approach this case methodically, gathering evidence piece by piece, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. Her decision to visit the precinct that day wasn't random. She had received a tip that one of the officers she was investigating, Paul Radford, was on duty. Paul had come up repeatedly in her research, his name tied to incidents that ranged from aggressive traffic stops to allegations of planting evidence. Alexis wanted to observe him in action, to see firsthand how he operated. When she entered the precinct, Alexis didn't announce herself. She wanted to blend in, to gauge the environment without the weight of her title influencing how people behaved. She approached the front desk and asked to speak to someone about a community program she claimed to be interested in, using it as a cover to stay in the building longer. Paul noticed her almost immediately. He had a keen eye for spotting people who didn't belong, and in his mind, Alexis fit the bill. She was too poised, too confident, too out of place in this chaotic environment. As she sat in the waiting area, Paul's irritation grew. He didn't recognize her, and that alone made him suspicious. "Who's she?" Paul muttered to another officer as he nodded in her direction. "Don't know. Said she's here about some program," the other officer replied with a shrug. Paul didn't like loose ends. He had learned over the years that leaving things unchecked often led to trouble. So he decided to confront her, to remind her, and everyone else, that this was his domain. As Paul approached Alexis, she could sense the shift in the air. She had seen men like him before, men who wore their authority like armor and wielded it like a weapon. She remained seated, her posture relaxed but alert, as he loomed over her. "You've been sitting here a while," Paul said, his tone sharp. "What are you really here for?" Alexis met his gaze, her expression calm. "I'm waiting for someone," she replied simply. Paul scoffed. "Funny. You don't look like someone who's just waiting." Alexis didn't flinch. "And you don't look like someone who greets visitors with a smile." The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of others nearby. Paul's jaw tightened as he felt the subtle challenge in her words. He didn't like being talked back to, especially not by someone who, in his mind, should know better than to question him. "What's your name?" Paul demanded, his voice louder now. Alexis didn't answer immediately. She could feel the weight of the stares around her, the unspoken judgments hanging in the air. Finally, she said, "I don't see how that's relevant." That was the last straw for Paul. "Stand up," he barked. When Alexis didn't move right away, Paul's hand went to his belt. The moment escalated quickly, and within seconds, the entire room was watching as Paul pulled out his pepper spray and aimed it at Alexis. The spray hit her face before she could react fully, the searing pain blinding her as she stumbled back. The room erupted in murmurs, some shocked, others indifferent. Alexis gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay upright as tears streamed down her face. "Next time, show some respect," Paul muttered as he walked away, leaving her to recover on her own. But Alexis wasn't just another civilian caught in the crossfire of abuse and power. She was someone with the skills, resources, and determination to make sure that Paul, and the system he thrived in, would be held accountable. What had started as a humiliating encounter was about to unravel into a reckoning no one in that precinct saw coming. The hours after the incident felt like an eternity. Alexis had left the precinct shortly after composing herself, her vision still blurry, her eyes stinging from the pepper spray. She had declined offers of assistance from bystanders, knowing she couldn't afford to show vulnerability. Instead, she had driven to a nearby safe house, a modest apartment she had rented as part of her cover, and locked the door behind her. Alone in the silence, she allowed herself a moment to let the pain and humiliation sink in. She stood before the bathroom mirror, her reflection blurred but vivid enough to remind her of what had just happened. The anger inside her was like a coiled spring, growing tighter with every passing second. Yet, Alexis was no stranger to controlling her emotions. She had been trained to think ahead, to move with precision and strategy. Losing control wasn't an option, not now. As she rinsed her face with cold water, the sting began to subside, but the memory of Paul's smug expression burned brighter in her mind. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the culture that allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. Alexis took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and reached for her phone. A familiar voice answered on the second ring. "Agent Monroe, we've been waiting for your update." Alexis hesitated for a moment, her usual composure slipping. "The situation escalated," she said, her tone measured but laced with tension. "I need to accelerate the timeline." "What happened?" Alexis recounted the incident in a calm, clinical manner, leaving out the raw emotion she had felt in the moment. "He didn't recognize me," she concluded. "None of them did." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That could work in your favor," her handler said. "If you're ready to move, we can authorize the next steps." "I'm ready," Alexis replied firmly. "It's time to bring this into the open." The following day, Alexis returned to the precinct, her resolve unshaken. She had spent the night preparing, going over every detail of her plan. This time, she wasn't there to observe. She was there to act. As she stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. Officers moved about with the same air of authority, but Alexis noticed the subtle undercurrents, the way conversations stopped as she passed, the sideways glances, the murmured comments just loud enough for her to catch. Word of the previous day's confrontation had clearly spread. Paul was at his desk, flipping through paperwork with a bored expression. When he saw Alexis, his jaw tightened, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Back so soon?" he called out, his tone dripping with mockery. Alexis didn't answer. Instead, she walked straight to the front desk and requested a meeting with the precinct's captain. The desk officer hesitated, glancing nervously in Paul's direction. "The captain's busy," he said. "I'll wait," Alexis replied calmly, her eyes locked on the officer. Paul approached, his footsteps heavy on the tiled floor. "You don't seem to learn, do you?" he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're wasting your time." Alexis met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." The captain eventually emerged, a middle-aged man with a weary face and a demeanor that spoke of years spent trying to balance politics and justice. He looked at Alexis, then at Paul, and frowned. "What's going on here?" "I'd like to speak with you privately," Alexis said. The captain hesitated but nodded, leading her into his office. Paul watched them go, his smirk faltering for the first time. Inside the office, Alexis didn't waste time. She presented her badge, the bold letters FBI, catching the captain's attention immediately. His eyes widened, and he leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. "What's this about?" he asked. "I've been conducting an undercover investigation into allegations of misconduct within your department," Alexis began. "Yesterday's incident only confirmed what I've been suspecting." The captain paled. "I didn't authorize any investigation, you didn't have to," Alexis interrupted. "The FBI doesn't need your permission to investigate corruption, excessive force, or racial bias. And based on what I've seen so far, your department has a lot to answer for." The captain was silent, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Alexis could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to calculate his next move. "You realize the implications of this, don't you?" he said finally. "I do," Alexis replied. "The question is, do you?" Meanwhile, outside the office, the tension in the precinct was palpable. Officers whispered among themselves, their curiosity and unease growing. Paul, however, remained confident. He had weathered storms before, and he was certain this one would pass as well. But as the minutes ticked by, his confidence began to waver. When Alexis and the captain finally emerged, the captain's expression was grim, and Alexis looked more resolute than ever. "Agent Monroe will have full access to our records," the captain announced, addressing the room. "Cooperate with her fully." "That's an order." The room fell silent. Paul's jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. Alexis didn't look at him as she began walking toward the records room, but she could feel his glare burning into her back. Over the next few days, Alexis worked tirelessly, combing through files, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together a picture of the department's inner workings. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became that Paul wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a much larger problem. Her investigation uncovered a pattern of abuses that spanned years, cases of excessive force, falsified reports, and discriminatory practices that had gone unpunished. Paul's name appeared repeatedly, tied to some of the most egregious incidents. When Alexis confronted him directly, the exchange was electric. "You think you're better than me?" Paul sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what it's like out there, dealing with the garbage we have to deal with every day." "I know exactly what it's like," Alexis shot back. "And I know the difference between doing your job and abusing your power." Paul's face darkened, but he said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. As Alexis continued her work, the tension in the precinct reached a breaking point. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to Paul's behavior began to distance themselves, sensing that the tides were shifting. Paul, for the first time in years, found himself isolated, his once unshakable confidence starting to crumble. By the end of the week, Alexis had built a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny. She had the evidence she needed to expose not just Paul, but the entire culture that had allowed him to thrive. But she wasn't done yet. There was one more step to take, one final move that would ensure justice was served. And as she prepared for what was to come, she knew that the fallout would be seismic. The stage was set, the players in position. What happened next would change everything. The precinct was unusually quiet for a Friday morning. The hum of everyday activity was still there, the phones ringing, the occasional chatter, but it felt muted, as though the building itself could sense the storm brewing. Alexis walked through the hallway with purpose, her heels clicking against the tile floor, a sharp, steady rhythm that drew the attention of everyone she passed. She had spent the last week meticulously preparing for this moment, and now there was no room for hesitation. In her hand, she carried a file thick with evidence, documents, photographs, testimonies. Everything she needed to make her case. But the weight of what she was about to do wasn't just in the papers, it was in the knowledge that this moment would change lives, some for better and some for worse. Inside the captain's office, Paul was already seated, his posture rigid, his face a mask of thinly veiled irritation. He had been summoned to the meeting without explanation, and the lack of control over the situation was gnawing at him. He hated surprises. When Alexis entered, Paul's eyes narrowed. He had spent the last few days watching her move through the precinct like she owned the place, and it had taken every ounce of restraint not to confront her again. But now, as she walked in with that file in her hand and an air of quiet authority, something in him shifted. The captain was seated behind his desk, his expression strained. He gestured for Alexis to take a seat, but she remained standing, her eyes fixed on Paul. "Agent Monroe," the captain began, his voice uneasy. "I hope this is as important as you've made it seem." "It is," Alexis said, her tone steady. She placed the file on the desk, her movements deliberate, and opened it. "What I'm about to present will explain everything." Paul leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another lecture about how we're all supposed to be saints while dealing with criminals every day." Alexis ignored him, pulling out the first document. "This is a report from 3 years ago," she said, sliding it across the desk toward the captain. "An excessive force complaint filed against Detective Radford. The case was closed without investigation." The captain glanced at the paper but said nothing. "This," Alexis continued, pulling out another document, "is a photograph from a traffic stop last year. The driver filed a complaint for racial profiling. Again, no investigation." Paul's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "You're digging up old news," he said. "None of this proves anything." Alexis met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "It proves a pattern, detective. A pattern of abuse that you've gotten away with for far too long." Paul's jaw tightened. "You think you can come in here and judge me? You don't know what it's like to be on the front lines. And you don't know what it's like to be on the receiving end of your so-called judgment," Alexis shot back, her voice rising slightly. "The people you've hurt, the lives you've ruined, they know." The tension in the room was palpable. The captain shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between Alexis and Paul. "This isn't just about you, detective," Alexis said, her voice firm. "It's about a system that has enabled you. A system that has turned a blind eye to misconduct and allowed it to thrive." Paul stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I've had enough of this," he said, his voice loud and angry. "You come in here with your accusations and your files, but you don't know a damn thing about what it takes to do this job." Alexis didn't flinch. "What it takes is integrity," she said. "And you've shown time and time again that you don't have it." Paul's fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're better than me? You think flashing that badge makes you untouchable?" "No," Alexis said, her voice calm but cutting. I think doing my job makes me better than you. And my job is to hold people like you accountable. The captain finally spoke, his voice firm but hesitant. That's enough, he said, looking at Paul. Detective, sit down. Paul hesitated, his chest rising and falling with barely contained fury, but he eventually obeyed. Alexis reached into the file and pulled out a final document, a list of names. These are the people who've filed complaints against you, she said, her voice quieter now but no less powerful. People who deserve justice. And they're going to get it. Paul's face turned red, his composure cracking for the first time. You think you can ruin me? He spat. You think you can take everything I've worked for? You ruined yourself, Alexis said. All I did was expose the truth. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The captain leaned forward, his hands clasped together. What happens now? He asked, his voice low. Alexis closed the file and straightened her posture. What happens now is up to the department, she said. You can either take responsibility and begin the process of reform, or you can continue to cover this up and face the consequences when it goes public. Paul stared at her, his eyes burning with hatred. You won't get away with this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexis looked at him, her expression unyielding. I already have. The meeting ended in silence, but the fallout was immediate. News of the investigation spread quickly, and within hours, the precinct was in chaos. Officers whispered in hushed tones, rumors flying faster than anyone could keep up with. Paul retreated to his desk, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. But Alexis wasn't done yet. She had one more card to play, and it was the one that would bring everything to a head. As she prepared for the next phase of her plan, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The truth was out, but justice was still hanging in the balance. The precinct felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Paul paced in the locker room, his footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. His mind was spinning, his thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, fear, and indignation. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, the kind of officer who could operate with impunity. Now, with Alexis's investigation closing in, that illusion was crumbling. He stopped abruptly, slamming his fist against the locker. The metallic clang reverberated through the empty space, but it didn't release the frustration boiling inside him. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed the device to his ear. Yeah, it's me, he said when the line connected. We've got a problem. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached. I heard. The FBI's involved now. Paul's grip on the phone tightened. This isn't just a routine investigation. She's digging up everything, cases, complaints, everything. What do you want me to do? Paul hesitated, his mind racing. I don't know yet. Just, be ready. He ended the call and leaned against the locker, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, exposed. It was a feeling he didn't know how to handle. Meanwhile, Alexis sat in the small apartment she had been using as her base. The file that had been her weapon in the meeting now lay open on the table, its contents scattered around her. She stared at a photograph of Paul attached to one of the complaints, her thoughts heavy. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her reverie. It was her handler. How did it go? The voice asked when she answered. The meeting went as expected, Alexis replied. He's rattled, but he's not going down without a fight. That was always a risk. I know, Alexis said. She hesitated for a moment, then added, but there's more. I've uncovered evidence that suggests this goes deeper than Paul. There's a network, officers covering for each other, suppressing complaints, falsifying reports. Her handler was silent for a moment. That's big, Alexis. Are you ready for what that means? Alexis nodded, even though she knew he couldn't see her. I've been ready for this my whole life. The next day, Alexis returned to the precinct, her presence now an unmistakable symbol of accountability. Officers avoided her gaze, their unease palpable. Paul, however, was waiting for her near the entrance, his arms crossed and his expression dark. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. Alexis didn't slow her stride. "I'm busy." Paul stepped into her path, forcing her to stop. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low but intense. "You're playing with fire." "I'm doing my job," Alexis replied, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. Paul leaned closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you're some kind of hero, but all you're doing is painting a target on your back. People like me, we don't just roll over." Alexis's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "People like you only have power because the system protects you. But that's changing. And whether you like it or not, you're going to answer for what you've done." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick and electric. Then Paul stepped back, a cold smile spreading across his face. "We'll see about that," he said, turning and walking away. The confrontation only fueled Alexis's determination. She spent the rest of the day gathering the final pieces of evidence she needed, combing through records and conducting interviews. Each new discovery reinforced what she already knew: Paul was just the tip of the iceberg. By evening, Alexis had everything she needed. She called her handler and set up a meeting for the following morning to present her findings. As she hung up, she felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The end was in sight, but she knew the final steps would be the hardest. The next morning, Alexis arrived at the precinct with a team of federal agents. The sight of them, dressed in suits, their presence commanding, sent ripples of unease through the building. Officers whispered among themselves, their faces pale as they watched the team head straight for the captain's office. Paul was in the middle of a conversation when he saw them. His stomach dropped, but he quickly masked his fear with a facade of defiance. As Alexis and the agents walked past him, he called out. "This is a witch hunt," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're trying to destroy good cops." Alexis stopped and turned to face him. "Good cops don't abuse their power," she said. "And they don't need to hide behind lies." The room fell silent, all eyes on them. Paul's face reddened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. In the captain's office, Alexis laid out her findings with meticulous detail. She presented the evidence of Paul's misconduct, the patterns of abuse, and the network of officers who had enabled it. The captain listened in silence, his face growing grimmer with each passing minute. When she finished, the captain leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy. "This is bad," he said. "It's more than bad," Alexis replied. "It's systemic. And it needs to stop." The captain nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Full cooperation," Alexis said. "And immediate action against Paul and the others involved." The captain hesitated, then nodded again. "You'll have it." The following hours were a blur of activity. Arrests were made, files were seized, and the precinct was thrown into chaos. Paul watched from the sidelines, his anger and fear boiling over as he realized the walls were closing in. By the end of the day, he was in handcuffs, his badge and gun taken from him. As Alexis watched him being led away, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and a lingering sadness for the system that had allowed this to happen. Paul turned to her one last time, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," he said. But Alexis didn't respond. She didn't need to. Justice had been served, and for now, that was enough. The precinct was in shambles. The once routine hum of operations had turned into a cacophony of whispered conversations, hurried footsteps, and tense phone calls. Officers who had once walked the halls with confidence now avoided eye contact, their movements cautious, as if they feared any misstep might bring Alexis's scrutiny upon them. Paul's arrest had sent shockwaves through the department. He had been a dominant presence for years, a figure both respected and feared, and now he was gone, hauled out in handcuffs by federal agents. His desk sat empty, a silent testament to his fall from grace. But his absence left a vacuum, and the lingering question on everyone's mind was the same: who would be next? Alexis remained a steady presence in the precinct, her demeanor calm but unyielding. She wasn't there to gloat or revel in her success, she was there to ensure the changes she had fought for would stick. She knew all too well that dismantling a corrupt system wasn't just about removing a single bad actor. It was about addressing the rot that allowed people like Paul to thrive in the first place. As she sat in a makeshift office, going over the final stages of her investigation, there was a knock on the door. She looked up to see Captain Harris standing there, his face lined with fatigue. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You've certainly turned this place upside down," he said, attempting a weak smile. "It needed to happen," Alexis replied, not looking up from her papers. "You knew that." Harris sighed and sat down across from her. "I did," he admitted. "But knowing it and living through it are two very different things." Alexis finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Captain, you've been here a long time. Long enough to see what was happening. Why didn't you act sooner?" Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy. "Because it's not that simple," he said. "You think I didn't want to? You think I didn't see what Paul was doing? Of course I did. But every time I tried to push back, there was another hurdle: union protections, higher-ups who didn't want the bad press, officers who threatened to walk out if I pressed too hard. And what about the people who suffered because of that inaction?" Alexis asked, her voice sharp. "The victims who filed complaints, who begged for help, only to be ignored." Harris flinched, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I failed them. I failed this department. And now I have to live with that." Alexis studied him, searching for sincerity in his words. She saw the regret there, the guilt etched into his features. But regret wasn't enough. "What are you going to do about it now?" she asked, her tone softer but still firm. Harris straightened in his chair, his expression resolute. "Whatever it takes to fix this," he said. "To make sure it doesn't happen again." It was a start, Alexis thought. But actions would speak louder than words. Later that day, Alexis called a meeting with the remaining officers in the precinct. They gathered in the briefing room, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Alexis stood at the front, her posture commanding yet approachable. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice steady and firm. "This investigation isn't just about Paul Radford. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that this department serves the community it's meant to protect, not abuses its power." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I know many of you feel uncertain right now. You're questioning whether you'll be next, whether you've done something that will come under scrutiny. And if you have, then yes, you should be worried. But if you're here to do the right thing, if you're here because you believe in justice, then you have nothing to fear." One of the younger officers raised his hand hesitantly. "What happens now?" he asked. "Change happens now," Alexis replied. "It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But it starts with each of you. It starts with acknowledging what's been allowed to happen here and committing to do better." There was a murmur of agreement among some of the officers, but others remained silent, their expressions guarded. Alexis knew it wouldn't be a unanimous shift. Change rarely was. As the meeting dispersed, Alexis caught sight of one of the officers lingering by the door. She recognized him, Officer Davis, one of Paul's closest allies. He had been conspicuously silent during the investigation, neither defending Paul nor condemning him. Now, he approached her, his expression unreadable. "I want to talk," he said simply. Alexis nodded, leading him into her office. Once inside, Davis hesitated, his eyes darting around the room before finally settling on her. "I've been here a long time," he began, his voice low. "Long enough to see a lot of things I wish I hadn't." "And?" Alexis prompted. "And I didn't do anything about it," Davis admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I looked the other way because it was easier. Because I didn't want to make waves." Alexis leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't keep pretending it's not my problem," Davis said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't want to be like Paul. I want to make it right." Alexis studied him for a moment, gauging his sincerity. "If you're serious about that, there's a way you can help," she said. "But it's not going to be easy." "I'll do whatever it takes," Davis said, his voice firm. "Good," Alexis replied. "Because it starts with telling the truth." Over the next few days, Davis became a key ally in the cleanup effort. He provided information about the inner workings of the department, details that had been buried for years. His willingness to come forward inspired others to do the same, and slowly but surely, the culture of silence began to crack. But not everyone was on board. A small faction of officers, loyal to Paul and resistant to change, began to push back. They spread rumors about Alexis, questioning her motives and painting her as an outsider who didn't understand the realities of their job. One afternoon, Alexis found herself confronted by a group of these officers in the hallway. Their leader, a burly man named Sergeant Miller, stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "You think you can just waltz in here and tear this place apart?" he said, his tone dripping with hostility. "You don't know us. You don't know what it's like out there." "I know enough," Alexis replied calmly. "And what I've seen is unacceptable." Miller scoffed. "You're making enemies, Agent Monroe. Don't think for a second that everyone here is on your side." Alexis met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not here to make friends," she said. "I'm here to make things right." As the group dispersed, Alexis felt a surge of determination. The resistance only reinforced her belief in the importance of her work. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. The days stretched into weeks, and the precinct began to transform. Policies were overhauled, training programs implemented, and a new standard of accountability set in place. Alexis knew the work was far from over, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope. Still, the question lingered in the back of her mind, would it be enough? Would the changes stick, or would the system find a way to revert to its old ways? The answer remained uncertain, but one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. The true test of their resolve was yet to come. The air inside the precinct had shifted. The weight of change hung over everyone like a thick fog, palpable and inescapable. Officers moved through the halls with a mix of unease and determination. Some had embraced the new direction, cautiously optimistic about what it could mean for their department and the community they served. Others resisted, their resentment simmering just beneath the surface, a quiet defiance that lingered in their glares and hushed conversations. Alexis could feel the tension as she walked through the building, her presence a constant reminder of the upheaval. She had become both a symbol of accountability and a target for blame, depending on who you asked. But she didn't let it deter her. There was too much at stake to worry about bruised egos. In her temporary office, Alexis was reviewing a stack of reports when Officer Davis knocked on the doorframe. He looked more composed than he had in weeks, though there was still a shadow of guilt in his eyes. "Got a minute?" he asked. Alexis nodded, setting down the report she had been reading. "Come in." Davis stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his tone cautious. "I've been hearing whispers," he said. "Some of the guys, Miller's group, they're not letting this go." Alexis leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral. "What kind of whispers?" "They're angry," Davis said. "They think you're here to destroy the department, not fix it. They're talking about pushing back, making things difficult for you. Alexis studied him, searching for any hint of ulterior motives, but his concern seemed genuine. Difficult how? She asked. Davis hesitated, glancing at the floor before meeting her gaze. It's just talk right now, but Miller, he's not the type to stop at talk. He's loyal to guys like Paul, and he doesn't like what you're doing. Alexis nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. I'll handle it. Davis shifted uncomfortably. Look, I know I've said this before, but I want to help. I want to make this right. You already are, Alexis said, her tone softer. You've taken a big step, and it's making a difference. Davis seemed to relax slightly, a small weight lifted from his shoulders. Thanks, he said. I'll keep my ears open. After he left, Alexis sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. She had expected resistance, it was inevitable in a situation like this, but the idea of active sabotage was a new layer of complexity. She couldn't let it distract her, but she also couldn't ignore it. Later that afternoon, as Alexis was heading toward the captain's office, she spotted Miller leaning against a wall, his arms crossed. His eyes followed her as she approached, his expression unreadable. Agent Monroe, he said, his voice low and steady. Got a minute? Alexis stopped, meeting his gaze. What is it, Sergeant? Miller pushed off the wall and took a step closer, his posture casual but his tone laced with tension. I just wanted to say, not everyone here thinks you're doing the right thing. I'm aware, Alexis replied evenly. But I'm not here for a popularity contest. Miller smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. That's obvious. But you might want to consider what happens when you push too hard. Is that a threat? Alexis asked, her voice calm but sharp. Just an observation, Miller said, his smirk fading. People don't like feeling cornered. Sometimes they lash out. Alexis didn't flinch. If anyone lashes out, Sergeant, they'll find themselves answering for it. I suggest you think about that. Miller held her gaze for a moment longer before shrugging. Suit yourself, he said, turning and walking away. The interaction left Alexis unsettled, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. She met with Captain Harris, briefing him on the latest developments and laying out her recommendations for the next steps. As the evening wore on, Alexis remained at the precinct, working late into the night. The building was quiet now, the usual buzz replaced by an eerie stillness. She was engrossed in her work when a sharp knock at the door startled her. Come in, she called. The door opened to reveal Davis, his expression tense. We need to talk, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. What's going on? Alexis asked, sitting up straighter. It's Miller, Davis said, his voice low. He's planning something. I overheard him talking to a couple of the guys. They're trying to find a way to undermine you, make it look like you're overstepping. Alexis frowned, her mind racing. Did he say how? Davis shook his head. Not exactly. But he's got people on his side, and they're not afraid to bend the rules. Alexis nodded, her jaw tightening. Thank you for telling me. I'll take care of it. Davis hesitated, then said, Be careful, Agent Monroe. Miller's not stupid, and he's not afraid to play dirty. Alexis gave him a small, reassuring smile. I can handle it. After Davis left, Alexis leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. She knew she had to act quickly, but she also had to be careful. If Miller and his group were trying to discredit her, she couldn't give them any ammunition. The next morning, Alexis called a meeting with Captain Harris and a small group of trusted officers. She laid out what she knew, emphasizing the need for vigilance and unity. We can't let this derail the progress we've made, she said. If anyone tries to sabotage this investigation, we need to respond swiftly and decisively. Harris nodded, his expression serious. We're with you, he said. Whatever it takes. Over the following days, the tension in the precinct reached a boiling point. Miller's group grew bolder, their whispers turning into open defiance. Alexis remained steadfast, refusing to be intimidated, but she could feel the weight of their resistance pressing down on her. Then, one afternoon, the situation came to a head. Alexis was reviewing a report in her office when the door burst open, Miller standing in the doorway with a folder in his hand. "What is this?" he demanded, slamming the folder onto her desk. Alexis opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a collection of documents, twisted to paint her investigation as overreaching and biased. "This is pathetic," Alexis said, closing the folder and meeting Miller's glare. "You think you can stop me with this?" Miller leaned closer, his voice low and menacing. "You're out of your depth, Monroe. You don't belong here." Alexis stood, her posture commanding. "No, Sergeant. You don't belong here. And I will make sure everyone sees that." The confrontation left the entire precinct on edge. The lines had been drawn, and it was clear that there would be no compromise. But Alexis refused to back down. The work she was doing was too important, and she wouldn't let anyone stand in her way. As the days went on, the tide began to turn. More officers came forward, emboldened by Alexis's determination and Davis's example. The culture of silence was breaking, and the department was starting to transform. But Alexis knew the fight wasn't over. The real test would come in the days ahead, as the changes she had fought for were put to the test. And she was ready for whatever came next. The precinct was unrecognizable from the one Alexis had first walked into weeks ago. The air was lighter, though the tension from recent events still lingered like an aftershock. Paul was gone, facing a string of charges that would keep him tied up in court for years, and Miller, along with a handful of his allies, had been quietly removed from duty. Those who remained were different now, not perfect, but wary and more willing to question the status quo. Alexis stood outside the precinct one last time, watching as officers came and went, their routines slowly adapting to the changes she had fought for. Captain Harris approached, his face a mix of relief and lingering uncertainty. "It feels different, doesn't it?" he said, coming to stand beside her. "It should," Alexis replied. "You've got a clean slate now. What you do with it is up to you." Harris nodded, his expression serious. "We'll do better," he said. "We have to." "I'll be watching," Alexis said, her tone light but firm. "You know where to find me if you need help." Harris offered her a small smile. "I hope we don't, but if we do, I'll call." They shook hands, a gesture of mutual respect and understanding. Alexis turned and walked away, her step steady and confident. She didn't look back. Later that day, Alexis sat in her apartment, packing up the last of her belongings. The case files had been sent to federal prosecutors, and her part in the investigation was officially over. But as she folded a stack of papers into her briefcase, there was a knock at the door. It was Officer Davis, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He held a coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "I figured you could use a break," he said, holding up the bag. Alexis smiled, stepping aside to let him in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. "You're leaving soon?" Davis asked. "Tomorrow," Alexis replied. "Back to D.C. Another case, another city." Davis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I didn't think this place could change." "Not really. But you proved me wrong." Alexis raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do it alone." "You lit the fire," Davis said. "The rest of us just had to decide whether we were going to let it burn out or keep it going." Alexis took a sip of her coffee, letting his words sink in. "Keep it going," she said finally. "Even when it's hard." "Especially when it's hard." Davis smiled. "You've got my word." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past weeks settling into something lighter. Then Davis stood, setting his empty cup on the counter. "Take care of yourself, Agent Monroe," he said, offering her a firm handshake. "You too, Officer Davis," Alexis replied. "And remember, if you ever need backup, you know where to find me." After he left, Alexis finished packing, her mind already turning toward her next assignment. She felt a sense of closure, knowing that the work she had done here mattered. It hadn't fixed everything, it never could, but it had been a start. And sometimes, that was enough. Months later, the precinct had undergone a transformation. New policies were in place, training programs had been implemented, and a new culture was beginning to take root. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Davis had taken on a leadership role, working closely with Harris to ensure the changes stuck. Paul, meanwhile, faced trial after trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempts to paint himself as a victim fell flat. He was eventually convicted on multiple counts, his career and reputation in ruins. Miller, though not charged, found himself ostracized, unable to find work in law enforcement. His arrogance had been his undoing, leaving him to confront the reality of a life without the power he had abused for so long. As for Alexis, she had moved on to another case, another city, another fight. But the lessons from this investigation stayed with her. She knew the work was never truly done, and she carried that knowledge with her, using it to fuel her determination. To those who watched this story unfold, let it be a reminder that justice isn't always swift or easy. It takes courage to confront the truth, to stand against systems that seem insurmountable. But change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming resistance. What would you have done in Alexis's place? Could you have stood firm in the face of such opposition, or would the weight of it have been too much? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after the final word. See you in the next chapter.